Question 1. Describe why a particular combination of weak van der Waals and bonding and strong covalent bonding. So why is it both, first off? Yeah.
So you have the weaker van der Waals bonds, which break and allow for the microvoids to form, while the covalent bonds stay together and just get stretched out and form the fibrils.
Okay, yeah, that's basically the guts of it. So you have this weak secondary bonding, the van der Waals bonding, and those bonds break and reform, break and reform, break and reform as the chains move around, right? And so that's part of the process of crazing. The first step is hydrostatic stress. Second step is chain moving, and that's enabled or prevented based on the strength of the secondary bonds. Okay, so that is a key aspect of this. The other aspect of it, of course, is the primary covalent bonds, and so those chains do what they do because they're following the strong direction of the carbon-carbon bonds in that chain. All right, so the hydrostatic stress would not occur in these structures unless they were this macromolecular string of very strong bonds. All right, and so they pull away from that defect, cause hydrostatic stress to develop because of those strong carbon-carbon bonds. All right, and so it's this combination of both types of bonding. All right, so if the carbon-carbon bonds weren't very strong, this wouldn't happen. If the secondary bonding is extremely strong, this won't happen. All right, so it has to be the right combination of those two factors that work.
What is pulling away exactly in this
so
example?
We have the defect, right? And all the chains are trying to pull away from the surface of that defect. And that pulling away is being driven by this strong covalent bonding. And as was pointed out, I don't even know where the other quizzes are, you guys. Somewhere there are more quizzes in this room. Oh, come on. Somebody's sitting. I handed out 2 allotments. There should be quizzes sitting on a desk somewhere. Are they in here? I'm not seeing them. Anyway, and then as was also mentioned, the fibrils develop, and they develop the way they do because of the strong carbon-carbon bonds. I have notes. I have no idea where the quizzes vanished to. I made funny. And so those things together are what give you this strange behavior that we know of as crazing. And then I also ask, explain the role of both types of bonding during the initiation of crazing. Okay, what is the initiation of crazing? The development of? No, it's not the initiation. It's the very first thing. It has hydrostatic stress, negative hydrostatic stress. Very, 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 very first thing. All right, before voids develop, before fibrils develop, there was hydrostatic stress, negative hydrostatic stress. All right. And so as I said a minute ago, that the flaw interrupts the transmission of stress because it's not connected to that matrix, and it causes those localized regions of hydrostatic stress to develop. Any questions about that? And it's all, again, part and parcel of the secondary bonding and the primary covalent bonding. Yeah?
So you said hydrostatic stress causes the initiation of crazing?
Yeah, so the rearrangement of chains leads to hydrostatic stress that enhances the free volume. That free volume allows the chains to move and then separate themselves away from the defect area and cause the initial microvoid development. So it's all hand in hand associated with free volume, which itself is triggered by this hydrostatic stress, all right, that develops in the region of those defects. Does that all make sense? All right, so you guys watched the video over and over again, right? Because you knew this was coming. Let's describe 3 important differences between a crack and a craze. Yeah?
Crazes can self-heal over time.
That's one, right? Cracks typically don't. Maybe with polymers, if you smushed it together, maybe it might heal ultimately, but generally when we think of cracks, they don't heal. What's another difference? Or what's another important difference between a crack and a craze that you, yeah?
Like cracks are like 100% void space.
That's right. There's nothing bridging a crack. Right. As you saw at the very end of those videos, a crack forms. There's nothing holding those two edges together, and it just flies across that bar and separates things. What else?
I didn't feel confident to write this down on the paper yet, but I don't think cracks can get like hyper concentrated in the same way crazes can, like due to the craze having like very clean orientation.
What do you mean exactly? I'm not.
Like in the regions where you see like a lot of craze lines close together, would that be possible with cracks at all?
No, and it turns out that in most cases, once you form a crack, it's very unlikely that neighboring cracks will form. The primary crack becomes the largest flaw, and so it's the one that's most likely to advance. So yeah, that is, strictly speaking, that's true. Yes?
A crack can form at a high load rate and a craze cannot.
A crack will open at a high load rate?
Or a crack can start at a high load rate and a craze can't. You won't see crazing at the same high load rate that will cause a crack.
Ultimately, that's true. If you have if you go to a high enough load rate, it becomes a fully brittle material, and you don't get any crazes. Now that video doesn't show that, because even at the really high load rate, which is the impact fracture, you still get crazes for just a second before the thing breaks. But if you went any faster than that, yeah, you wouldn't get any crazing at all. Any other differences that you can think of? That's it? Okay. And then discuss the relative importance of loading rate. Why is rate important? Yeah?
Crazes need time to develop.
Yeah, they need a lot of time. Order of seconds to develop. Cracks don't need any time. All right. So loading rate is very important in terms of which outcome you get. All right, and then
That's it.
yeah, but let's think a little more broadly. So if you have a craze, as you saw, those crazes can form under a variety of different conditions. All right, and their character, content, frequency, size, all those things can vary with different loading rates. All right, crack's going to crack. It's over a wide range of stresses. It's just going to be one crack and it flies through the solid. All right. So there's a little difference there as well. Yeah.
So is this saying like a higher load rate leads to more crazing, or what's the dependency?
So the dependency, as you saw, the video had these different load rates, and as you went from one relatively slow rate to a slightly higher load rate, you saw more crazes develop than the initial load rate.
And then there's just the cracking has no dependency at all on the load rate?
If the crack is going to occur, then you don't get more than one crack. You get just one failure, one crack in those solids, regardless of rate. If it's going to crack, it's just going to be one, not many, which sort of relates to what Kevin was talking about.
What did
Yes?
you kind of just say before that about the crazes can form under multiple circumstances? What did you say about the crack part?
What was that?
You said just what did you keep it rephrase what you said basically?
So with the crazes, those will occur under a variety of different loading conditions, and their character, content, frequency, size, all of those depend on the loading conditions, as the video will tell you. But a crack, on the other hand, if it's going to form, it doesn't really care. I mean, it'll happen at a high low rate, it'll happen at a low rate, but you're not going to see any real variations beyond that. Okay, feel a little more comfortable with that video now, I hope. If you put your names on those and hand them forward, please. Okay, so today we're going to talk about recycling and, whoa, why does it look so fuzz? Okay, now it's better. And so just a few statistics about trash. And humans have produced 18.2 trillion pounds of plastic since the 1950s. That's a lot of elephants. All right. And then this was 2017, I believe. It says half of all plastic that has ever existed was made in the past 13 years. Okay, so in 2030, 13 years from 2017, there will probably be more than half of all plastic that ever existed was made in that intervening time period. Okay, so things aren't going to get better, they're just going to get worse. Oh, okay. Thank you. Any more? All right. And of course, there's literally a ton of plastic garbage for every person on Earth. So this is an issue. This is not true for ceramics and glass. Might be true for metal, though. I'm not sure. I don't think it's that much. It's a lot per person, but probably not a ton of metal. And the large growth rate is one of the real issues. And of course, as you'll see throughout the rest of the lecture, the U.S. lags behind China and Europe in recycling plastic material. Part of that is the nature of the country, how it's spread out. Europe, is a relatively small area, and they're all sitting on top of each other. And so this concept of recycling is way more important because they just can't find another place to throw a landfill in Europe. They've used up all those spaces, and every other space has a castle on it or something like that because everything's been around for so long there. All right, it's like you walk down the street and kick over a rock, and there's 10,000 years of history under that rock. In the U.S., it's not like that. All right, so we can always find some place to create a new landfill. And so on. The EU, of course, is trying to get ahead of this. 90% recycled by 2025, cut in half the litter from the 10 items that turn up in the oceans most often. We'll come back to this very shortly here as well. So there's lots of things that can be done that are necessarily being done. Total number of plastic bags. All right, so we're talking about LDPE, this guy here. All right, used worldwide annually, it's about 1 trillion, probably more than that. Trillion with a T. The number of plastic bags used every minute, at least 1 million. All right, so while I'm standing here going over the slide, 1 million plastic bags will have been used in this context. Total number of years it takes for a plastic bag, and this is again LDPE, to degrade 1,000 years. So here we have this really insubstantial, kind of unimportant object. It doesn't save anybody's lives. It doesn't need to hold an airplane or anything up with its weight. It's just got this one job to do, and then we don't care about it, but it still takes 1,000 years to break down. And this is just LDPE, which is, as you should know now, not the most sophisticated, high-tech, high-property plastic that we make. Far from it. But it still takes a very long time for it to break down, which seems ridiculous to me. Total amount of plastic bags that were discarded in 2008, 3.5 million tons. It's probably twice that now, maybe. Total amount of plastic floating in every square mile of the ocean, 46,000 pieces. All right, so you guys have heard about microplastics, right? Maybe some of the news came around. So we all carry some microplastics around in our bodies. We drink it whenever we have a bottle of water. You get microplastics from opening that bottle of water. The polypropylene fragments and generates tiny particles of polypropylene, which you then drink. So keep that in mind next time you drink a bottle of water. And so this is an issue, of course, in the ocean, because if we start to poison the ocean life, then boom, we no longer have saltwater fish, and all that goes away. So that's not a small thing. Average amount of plastic bags consumed per family and 4 trips to the grocery store, 60, which sounds about right. Percent of plastic made every year that will end up in the ocean, 10%, which is a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. Percent of household waste that is plastic, 11%, which I always think is low. I think it's more than that. Total amount of plastic bags in the U.S., 100 billion. Total pounds of PET bottles and jars as of 2010, 5.35 billion. And the average amount of plastic bottles a U.S. household will use every year is 500, which is probably about right, I think. Depends on the size of the household. All right, so plastic waste is an issue, and it's accumulating, and we need to do something about it. And so what we worry about, or we try to do, is recycling. And PET is the best example of this because that's why it's number one. It was set up as number one because it was the most easily recycled plastic, and they knew it back in 1977. All right, they knew it, and they are still correct in that initial guess. 1.557.2 million pounds in 2010, and then in terms of this total, we have 7.75 purchased by U.S. Reclaimer, and that's the recycled component, and 7 about the same purchased by export markets. Now, as you may have heard, a few years ago, China got tired of dealing with the crappy PET we were sending, and they said, oh, no more. You guys deal with it. So now we don't send them that much PET any longer. PET bottle component of mixed bales exported, which you'll see in a moment. Total amount of post-consumer bottles, 1.557 million pounds. 113 million pound increase. Overall PET bottle recycling is about 29%. I don't think it's changed all that much over time. Maybe gotten a little better. But there have been increases in curbside program recycling and new efforts at commercial recovery, but the whole issue of China not accepting our crappy bottles anymore has kind of put a kink in that. But so there are some concerted programs out there to make this happen, and this just shows you the PET recycling versus time and what that looks like. And so you can see that it is gradually increasing, but not exactly at a galloping rate. Could be better for sure. All right, and so let's talk about what recycling actually means. And so in our mind's eye, coming into this, you think, oh, well, we'll take the 2-liter pop bottles and we'll turn them into 2-liter pop bottles. Turns out that doesn't happen because this is, at least not directly, PET is the best example of this. So you can recycle PET back into bottles, but it has to go through a chemical route, which we'll talk about in a second. In most cases, when we talk about recycling, what's actually happening is, in the case of PET, the bottles are being turned into fibers. Why? Because the FDA is concerned that if you use your 2-liter pop bottle and they just throw it through the extruder and turn it back into a 2-liter pop bottle, someone's germs will be on that plastic or in that plastic, and you might drink that, and it'll make you sick. In the scheme of things we're facing today, it seems like a pretty minor issue. But anyway, that was what led this charge to not recycle directly and as a primary melt recycling process. And so we make fibers for carpets or clothing, and that's fine because no one eats carpets or clothing, at least not intentionally. Yes?
What temperature do you have to melt PET at to get it to go through an extruder?
It's about 250 centigrade. You'll see that I have some examples here in this lecture.
All over the boiling limit. If it's below the boiling point, it should kill anything that's in there.
I'm not arguing with you. Those are the rules. Them's the rules. That's what they've come up with, and so the FDA won't let you do that directly. I agree completely. And like I said, compared to what we're dealing with now, it's just anyway. And then another way of recycling, it's kind of not recycling necessarily, is tertiary recycling, where the plastics are converted into various chemicals. And so we're going to talk about hydrolysis of PET today, but there's methanolysis of PET, which makes methanol, and there's glycolysis of PET, which makes glycol. So you can turn these things into various different materials, and from there go into something like a thermoset if you want to. And then the alternative, which is not really recycling at all, is quaternary, i.e. plastics are burned to produce energy. Any plastic being converted into CO2, of course, and we'll talk about PVC and why that has been a problem, and we just talked about this last lecture as well. The issue of chlorine-containing plastics has become a real problem in this context. And it's not hard to see that. First off, 1 pound of plastic produces 16,000 BTU, twice as much as coal. All right. So we talk about plastics as being solid gasoline. Well, here's taking that solid gasoline and burning that solid gasoline and getting some energy out of that. All right. So there's actually some pretty good, decent driving force for doing that. About 1/6 of all U.S. municipal waste is burned. Right, so there is a big program of burning this stuff, and certainly in landlocked areas, it is a very significant issue. And if you drive down 71 South, and about the same time the smell from the slaughterhouse and the water treatment plant hits your nose, you look to the left, and this is what you used to see: Columbus's trash burning power plant. Those 3 gigantic smokestacks were there. And so this is what Columbus used to do with a significant portion of their trash, is burn it. And so this was a relatively popular thing. However, what happened, and we talked about this last time, PVC or halogen-containing plastics, last time we talked about saran wrap, which was a much bigger threat than PVC pipes because it was so abundant. If you take this and you burn it, and this is the right temperature, in the presence of benzene-type compounds like that from polystyrene or a variety of other things, it can produce these carcinogenic dioxins, which, as I said last time, hang around forever. In spite of sunlight, acid, water, they're very stable. And what happened in this context is that they saw a higher rate of cancer in the folks who lived in urban crest, which was downwind of the trash-burning power plant. So I was here then. It wasn't like black clouds of smoke were coming out of the trash-burning power plant and drifting over the landscape. It wasn't visible, really. But because of the nature of the plume and where it was directed, they saw this correlation and said, we got to stop that. And so they had 2 choices. Upgrade the plant so that it burned at higher temperatures, all right? So to get to the point of getting higher temperatures and turning it into CO2 instead of dioxin, and that would cost a bunch of money, or blow the thing up. And so that's why you don't see those 3 smokestacks anymore when you drive down 71. They blew them all up and dropped them to the ground. And I think there's like a couple of businesses there, but there's a huge building that's gone too. So that whole thing is absent now, and it's arguably true that PVC did kill the trash burning power plant in this context, because Columbus didn't want to invest in increasing the temperature of the furnaces that were involved. So clearly this is important, and one of the key aspects of this is that this is what Rumpke deals with. This is what we give them in our bins when we put them at the curb. Okay, we have a whole bunch of different things in there. Hopefully we're good citizens and we've at least separated the high-density polyethylene and the PET from everything else. But most people aren't really good citizens. There's probably some polypropylene in there and who knows what else. And so we have to think about, well, how do we separate them? And what Rumpke does is they hire people. All right, they say, train you to know what a 1 gallon milk jug looks like, what a water bottle looks like, what plastic wrap looks like, a very important thing to know, what polypropylene looks like. You can be trained to do this. You can also look at it. Sometimes you see the number on the part, not always, but sometimes they see that. And so that's one way of doing this. First off, I wanted to show you this. Plastics recycling has been around for a very long time. And so this is a piece from a P47 plane kit, all right? And when I was a kid, I always thought, I put this thing together. How nice of them to connect the parts I want to this framework. So I could just pull them off the framework and start assembling. Isn't that cool? Turns out that these are the sprues, runners, and gates, all right? And so the plastic mold would come in through these pieces on the end, and it fills up everything. All right, so this is a bunch of runners, gates, and some of the parts have already come out here, and it leads into the part. And this all gets molded simultaneously. And when things didn't go well, say this fuselage is only half formed, the guy would take it and he'd throw it right back into the extruder. All right, so they've been using primary recycling in the plastics industry since they started making plastics, because it's so easy to do. And that's because it doesn't go out into the environment, it doesn't get germs and so forth on it, and they don't worry about it in that context. So plastics molding has been, I'll pass that around to you. If you've never seen one of those before, which maybe you haven't, it's a nice example of what this actually looks like. And so this issue of in-plant recycling was always with us, and it's been with us a very long time. Consumer plastics, of course, separation becomes a problem because it's not just that polypropylene that was being injection molded, it's everything else combined together. We have to get rid of them. Some things need to be thrown away. And density methods can be used. And when I first came across this, I thought, oh, this is way too complicated. But this is actually done in some places. You have a variety of plastics all mixed together, and maybe you only want 2 of those. You don't want the other ones. If you take them and dunk them in water, polystyrene and PVC sink, whereas polyethylene and polypropylene, those float. All right, and so we can separate them that way. And if we want to, which we might, you can separate the PVC from the polystyrene by putting them in salt water, density 1.2 grams per cc, and the polyethylene high density from low density polypropylene is separated in water or alcohol, density of 0.93 grams per cc, and then we can separate the LDPE from the polypropylene as well by putting that into a water alcohol mix. We might only want high density polyethylene, and PET is not in here. And this may be the only thing we want out of this original mixture of plastics. And so you may set it up so it just pulls out that polyethylene, and that's what gets recycled. And so this seems awfully complicated, but it is actually done in some contexts in order to separate these. And it's also, as you'll see in a moment, it's not done with this. All right, there's a lot of problems with this. You can't really do density separations with bottles. What you do is you chip them, and then you separate the chips. All right, and that's what makes this process economically efficient. Okay, so this is a movie which I can put on the website if you're interested. And so this is going to show you how this is done, how separation actually takes place. We start with bottles, and then a far more intelligent English person will narrate this for National Geographic.
But first, in the UK, we throw away billions of plastic bottles every year.
Can you hear anything?
We're getting much better at recycling them, but did you know that they can also be turned into clothing? This amazing process starts here at the Bottle Recycling Centre.
All right, so all this crap gets delivered.
The first stage is shredding.
Shredded into
When you throw away
pieces.
your bottle, you often leave a small amount of drink inside. Shredding all the bottles releases the unwanted liquid so it doesn't affect the quality of the plastic.
I could speed this up.
Shredded bottles are then wrapped in cellophane and boxed up ready to be shipped around the world. It may be rubbish to us, but to the Chinese textile industry, this plastic waste is a valuable commodity.
Now the Chinese don't want it either.
All over the world to feed the busy clothing industry. Sorting separates the clear plastic from the colored stuff. Clear plastic can be made into white clothes or material that can be dyed, so it's extremely valuable. Most clear plastic bottles have coloured lids and stickers on them, but these have got to go, so the bottles head for the baths. The coloured caps are made of a different plastic which floats. A worker can then strain them off the top.
That's polypropylene, floating.
Then there's a separate bath for the stickers, but the workers have to be careful around this one. It's corrosive caustic soda, very bad for the skin, but very good for removing labels.
We'll talk more about that in a second.
After all their swimming, what's left is a pile of clear plastic shreds. But it's rather wet. The next step is the ovens, where it's mixed with some light-coloured plastics. To produce white cloth, you need some light-shaded material in the mix.
They remove the water in this
The
step.
plastic will spend about 10 hours here in these rotating drums, slowly drying out.
This is a precursor to actually molding it into
These
anything.
workers have to maneuver their cart back and forth underneath the drums to catch the plastic as it falls out. But they've also got to mind their heads on all the other spinning ovens. So we've got our plastic bottles broken down and mixed to produce the right colours. But it's very hard to weave cloth from bits and pieces, so another step is needed.
Alright, so this is extrusion.
This rotating sprue where it's heated to 270 degrees Celsius.
270 in
This
this
melts
case.
the plastic, but to make cloth we don't want a big lump, we need thread. The liquid plastic is forced through a sieve and emerges on the other side as great long strings which are collected in a container below.
Alright. And then I think, let's see.
We've now got thread, but it isn't strong enough to make cloth yet. First it must be combined and stretched several times while being heated. This will bond the fibers together.
Okay. And that's what ends up giving us clothes from PET. Alright. as it says. The most famous piece of polyester is the white suit worn by John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. Anyway, that's an example of how this happens. Any questions about all that? All right, so this is giving you a lot of things that I'm going to talk about here. So reprocessed PET is used to make a variety of things. Simplest probably is pillow ski jackets insulation, because no one ever sees it, so it doesn't need to look very nice. Is there a question?
Yeah, is it pretty easy to dye the polyester? Or
Oh yeah, it's very easy. Yeah, if you want to. There's issues with that. It's a lower quality product. Typically, you want it to be relatively clean. Green PET is a problem, and they started making colored PET bottles, and then there was a pushback against them. So there's not as many as you used to. You still see light green ones, but you see all kinds of different colors, and the recyclers said stop doing that. So they stopped doing it. And insulation boards, another thing, that blue board that goes into the walls of houses. If you've ever seen a house built, they use insulation board. It's blue stuff, that's PET. Again, not something that we care so much about in terms of color, but it has a certain process involved and properties in the end. PET containers washed, shredded, and ground. They have to be dried. We'll talk more about that in a second. Injected with a foaming agent and gives you these blue blocks. One of the key aspects of this is that cost is still more expensive than making it directly out of oil. And this is showing you a slide, which I have to skip through here, but this is what we used to drink Coca-Cola out of, 64 ounce, glass bottles, all right? And so this consists of glass. It has a painted label. It has metal caps, all right? And so we shifted away from making things out of glass, and what we shifted towards is making them out of PET, and this is not version 1.0 of that by stretching measure. This is one of the earlier versions, and as you can see, there's a plastic boot on the bottom, black plastic, all right? They used to be about, 8 times as thick as that. When they first came out, they had a really big boot on it. And this is polyethylene and carbon black, and it's because they were worried about their 2-liter pop bottles blowing up. They didn't have a good handle on the blow molding process when they first started doing this, and so this is a huge issue. One thing they also started out with, and this isn't shown here, but they had paper labels, because they used paper labels on everything back then. And paper would be glue and paper, and the glue itself is a low molecular weight polymer. All right, and then they also, this one is not an example, they also started out with metal bottle caps. And all those things together was a terrible disaster in terms of trying to recycle, because you have to separate the metal, you have to separate the polyethylene from the PET, and you had to separate the paper, as you just saw in that video, from the plastic itself. And so what happened very shortly thereafter, they got rid of the boot on the bottle, and they figured out how to blow mold these things so they wouldn't explode. And then they also went to this shrink wrap label, which just falls right off, no glue involved, you don't need the caustic acid bath that you just saw in that video a minute ago. And they went to polymer caps. I don't know why they're still using polypropylene. I have no idea why they can't make polyethylene bottle caps or PET bottle caps for PET bottles. Makes sense to me, but for some reason they stick with polypropylene, which is the problem. And so that's kind of a partial evolution of how these things were modified with time. But you pass that ugly one around. I think it was like a 10-year process to get rid of those boots. All right, and so key to that is the fact that we have to extrude these things. And what you kind of saw in that video was this process of extrusion, and this can involve a lot of different things, but key to all of what we're talking about in the context of PET itself, which is this structure, which you now know well, if you combine it with water at these high temperatures, it breaks it down to ethylene glycol and terephthalic acid. And so this was part of the appeal of PET to the Plastics Council, is because you might want to do this on purpose, and if you want to make a bottle out of a bottle, you have to go through this pathway. All right, so no bugs can exist under these conditions. But if you're just trying to turn a bottle into fiber, this is a disaster, because you start lowering the molecular weight of your PET, you start changing its properties, you start changing its crystallization, as you'll see in a moment. Everything changes because of water left in the structure. And so all of this goes through these types of very expensive pieces of equipment, which in this case is running at, as you can see, 250 degrees Celsius. At the hottest case, they're also very complex pieces of machinery. Although that is key to this. And so what happens is we look at the properties of these things as a function of how it is handled. And so it's not as simple as we'd like it to be. We, in this case, compare virgin PET made from oil directly. We extrude it to make VPET. We then have PET bottles that we have all touched and covered in formic acid and all kinds of other things. And this goes through this post-consumer process, PCPET, so it's kind of like what you saw in that video. And then in this case, they also did an extra heat treatment, autoclaving, which is good because it sterilizes everything. All right, so that can be an important part of this as well. And so this is autoclaved post-consumer PET. And then what they did in this last step, which is a little odd, they took all the trash, autoclaved all the trash, and then pulled the PET bottles out of the trash. And so this sees not just PET, but everything else that goes into that exposure, and they called this rPET for as far as and then they did thermal analysis on it, as you might expect. So it's not that I'm obsessed with thermal analysis, it's the plastics industry is obsessed with thermal analysis. So don't blame me that I'm using this data. This is what they do, all right? It can tell you a lot. And so what you see in this context is the green stuff, the virgin PET. It's had no heat cycles at all. It's just the pellets, all right? Not even made into a bottle yet. And that's the green curve here. The melting point of that, all right, is 236.9. Post-consumer PET has been made into a bottle. Its melting point is about 236, not much different. And then the autoclaved post-consumer PET has now been through 2 heat cycles. All right, so it was made into a bottle, chipped, and then made into a bottle again. All right, its melting point has gone up to 248, and then the rPET has seen 2 heat cycles. Its melting point has gone up to 253.3. Any thoughts about why? Why is the melting point going up? Still PET. Yes?
Well, let's think of what made it before, or what makes the melting point go up before. If it's easier to crystallize,
Or makes more perfect crystals, right? What could do that? Yeah?
Would impurities from like all the other types of trash contribute to it?
It can, but it's contributing to one basic process. Yes?
Autoclave, if you heat it up and keep it at that temperature for a while, wouldn't that help crystallize the PET?
No, this is before all this molding takes place. So they made bottles out of this after it's gone through the autoclaving and sorting. So what you do is you heat these things up in these cycles. And in heating them up, even if you try to dry it out, there's going to be some water present. And that water, as you saw on the previous slide, can start chewing away at those PET chains. And in the reclaimed case, you've got acids and bases associated with cardboard and God knows what else. All right, and so those are all causing this process of molecular weight decline. You start declining the molecular weight, you make them shorter, mechanical properties are going to go down, chains can move around more easily, so they can crystallize more easily, and you end up making more perfect crystals. All right, that's what you're seeing. This is an evolution towards more perfect crystals caused by the fact that molecular weight is lower. Now, you may be thinking, what about chain ends? Shouldn't that drive the other way? And that's a good thought. But in this case, what you're doing, you're starting out with a really high molecular weight. Yeah, you're adding a few more chain ends, but you've hit this zone where crystallization becomes more perfect before there's too many chain ends to compromise the effect of the chain ends. Okay? You following me? If you thought that, good for you. All right, because that is an important counterpoint. That chain ends have more free volume, that should drive down molecular weight, but that hasn't happened yet. We haven't dropped the molecular weight that much. Any questions about that? All right, and this is showing you what's happening now as we take those same sources of plastic and we extrude them and make bottles out of them. All right, so rather than just those thermal treatments, we now turn them around, run them through an extruder, in some cases one more time, and so we now have, in this context, the virgin PET, which has now been made into a bottle. It's no longer a virgin. It's now a melting point of 248, and then we extrude the post-consumer PET. It has now seen 2 heat cycles. It's showing you the melting point of 248, and then the extruded autoclaved post-consumer PET, which now means 3 cycles. Its melting point is going up, and then the extruded reclaimed stuff, which has all this chemistry happen to it, has seen 3 heat cycles, and its melting point has gone up to 255. So we see the same thing happening in this context. These differences in molecular weight can drive differences in the perfection of the crystals that form, also the amount that forms, by the way, as well. And you kind of see that here. The amplitude of these peaks keeps increasing as we go through these different steps. You're getting more secondary crystallization than you got previously because the molecular weight's dropped down. You also see cold crystallization. All right, and that cold crystallization is also being affected by the size and length of the molecular chains. It starts out, whatever that is, 140, and starts to drop. All right, and so the chains reorganizing and making crystals becomes easier when the chains are shorter, and it takes less energy to cause cold crystallization to occur. All right, any questions about that? All right, so I hope this gets the point across that recycling is not as easy as we'd like it to be. All right, that's one of the key things you should take away from it. It sounds simple, but it's not that simple. It's not impossible, but it's not as simple as you'd like it to be. And so this puts numbers on all the hand waving I've been showing you. First off, we have number average molecular weight and weight average molecular weight. These are different types of measurements. This is showing you molecular weight information for the same plastic, and so the molecular weight of each of these the plastic is always the same, but the technique you use gives you different numbers. Okay, and so in this case, the weight average molecular weight is higher than the number average molecular weight, which is always true. All right, but it's the same plastic. It's really the same molecular weight. It's just different ways of measuring it. It's very annoying, but that's what they do. And then there's something called the polydispersity, which is the ratio of the weight average molecular weight over the number average molecular weight. And so what you're seeing is you start for the virgin stuff 30,500, post-consumer 26,500, autoclave post-consumer 24,900, and then the reclaimed stuff, which sees the most chemical degradation, is 23,900. And then you go through and you do another extrusion. You take all that chipped or shredded stuff, or in case of the virgin, it's just the initial beads, and then you extrude it into a bottle. And so now everything shifts downwards because you've seen even more thermal cycles. So you go from an original pellet molecular weight, in the worst case, you cut it in half in terms of its molecular weight. All right, so this is where the freedom to crystallize comes from, is the fact that the molecular weight has dropped so much that the chains can move around and crystallize and drive up the melting point of what's formed. And what forms is more perfect because the chains are shorter, and it takes more energy to cause it to melt. Does that make sense? Yes?
So you were just saying that the chain ends doesn't have an effect here because it's not that great of a molecular weight, but if we're saying that it's cut in half, wouldn't we think that at that point the chain ends would have an effect?
So if you start at whatever it is, you start at 30,000, so it's a really long chain, you make it half as long, yeah, there are twice as many chain ends, but it's only 1 versus 2 in a given unit volume. So it's not that many, not yet. If we cut it down to 1,000, oh, absolutely, yeah, you'd have a ton of chains in there, and then the melting points will start to drop again. All right, so there's some midway point where all you see is increases in perfection. You haven't gotten to the point where you start to decrease it by having so many chain ends in the system. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is there ever like a leveling off point where it'll stop reducing molecular weight?
Where what will stop doing?
Like the processing.
No, this will keep dropping every time you run it through a cycle. So you have water, PET, hydrolysis. Every time that one water molecule cuts that chain in half, or is trying to. All right, you keep doing it over and over again. Eventually, you have a monomer, or close to a monomer. You have terephthalic acid. Okay. Okay. All right. So each step in these processes is a cycle. We have all these different cycles. Every cycle decreases the molecular weight and changes the crystallinity. Shorter polymer chains allow for easier crystallite formation, and of course, you also get decreases in the cold crystallization. All right, which is a different thing. We can do this on purpose for primary recycling of bottles into bottles. All right, so we can deliberately tear it all the way down into terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol, and then turn it back into bottles. And the FDA is okay with that. All right, but the standard bulk recycling, like you saw in that video from China, you can't do it that way. You can't turn bottles into bottles that way. Hydrolysis is what we talked about, methanolysis, glycolysis. There's all sorts of different things that comes out of treating PET at high temperatures with different chemical compounds, not just water, but other compounds like methanol. All right, last but not least, disposal. All right, and so landfills only store waste. I don't know if you think it decomposes or something. You can go into the landfill south of town, down by Grove City, dig in that landfill. Well, even the one that's just south of where the trash burning power plant. There's a golf course there. I don't know if you guys noticed that. There's a golf course about where the trash burning power plant used to be, just south of it. That golf course is the old Columbus landfill. It's called Eagle's Nest or some fancy name like that. And in these landfills, you will find a hot dog that still looks like a hot dog, right? Because this landfill is protecting everything in that landfill from degradation. The example of why that I don't really have time to talk about, I'll do about it anyway. There used to be this cop show called 1 Atom 12, and these are one of the episodes. They dealt with an old landfill made in the 40s, where they were in LA. They were making landfills, and what the problem was is that there was these jets of burning gas coming out of the landfill because they were allowing things in the landfill to decay. It was making methane. The methane would catch on fire and make these interesting displays of gas burning on the surface of the ground. Okay. We don't want that to happen, all right? We don't like methane forming for a lot of different reasons now. And so the hot dog looks like a hot dog. I would not advise you eat it. The newspaper, you can still read the newspaper that's been sitting in that landfill. Not that you have to wash your hands afterwards because it's pretty toxic at that point. So these things only store waste. They don't actually decompose it. They're not supposed to. And so they eliminate human contact for long periods of time, meaning like thousands of years, free of moisture, airtight. You already have plastics. Like you saw, these plastic bags will last 1,000 years on their own, and now you're saying, okay, let's put you in a nice environment. You're going to degrade even less. Take more than 1,000 years to degrade. Anaerobic conditions retard biodegradation. Degradation is undesirable. All right, we don't want oxygen in the landfill. We don't want water in the landfill. We don't want anything in the landfill. We just want trash, and we want it to sit there and not do anything, ideally. All right, any questions? Okay, I'll see you guys. Oh, yes?
We take the methane and burn it?
We take the methane and we can burn it, or we can try to store it and do other things with it. So if you go to that Eagle's Nest golf course, they have methane reclaiming stations built into the edge of the golf course to pull it out now. But they didn't used to do that. Okay. Any other questions? All right, see you on Monday, right? Yes? Okay.